Welcome to this week's episode of the Rational Standard podcast. I'm your host, Nicholas Woode-Smith, and I'm joined by Martin Van Staden and Ayanda Zulu. Thank you for joining us. We are going to be having an interesting discussion about something that's been making waves on Twitter X, and also across a lot of social media. It's something that's close to the heart of South Africans on both sides of the spectrum. And we'll be following up that topic up with a general discussion of complaining about South Africa in general, which is the main topic that we'd like to discuss here on the Rational Standard podcast. But for our first topic, the ANC has been renaming streets, buildings, and towns since it was elected. This is pitched as transformation and an embrace of indigenous languages and ANC's struggle history. But opponents have pushed back against this claim, citing that name changes attack heritage and the identity of the people who actually live there. It is true that it seems that the majority of residents of these towns, notably Graaff-Reinet, which is being renamed to Robert Sobukwe Town, do not support any of these name changes. There does seem to be a sense that these renamings do not reflect the will of the people. Gayton McKenzie, the Minister of Sports, Arts, Culture, and there's a long list of names that they need to simplify that, and also the leader of the Patriotic Alliance, said in a parliamentary reply that while public hearings are meant to gather views, and most of these views do seem to be negative, they do not determine the outcomes, which kind of thinks, what's the point of the democratic process if they're not going to actually listen to anything that people are saying? This was similar in 2021 when the then Minister of Sports, Arts and Culture proposed 23 name changes in the Eastern Cape and received 12,402 signatures opposing the name changes and 690 emails objecting the name changes. None of these were taken into consideration. For the renaming of East London to Kugompo Kugompo Town, there was only 290 participants in the public hearings in 2019. For the renaming of Graaff-Reinet, Aberdeen and Adendorp, there were only 530 participants across 4 different hearings. This is by no means reflects the actual residents who live there. But I think I want to start with you, Martin, because you've written extensively about transformationism and the ideology behind a lot of these name changes. And I want to ask, what is the real reason these towns are being renamed? And I want to can you go into the NC's motivations here?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, look, the first thing to say here is that what people are saying about this not really being about heritage is completely correct. So, what a lot of people are correctly pointing out is that if the ANC was serious about, I mean, let's take the most simple example. If the people who are renaming Graaff-Reinet to Robert Sobukwe Town were really interested in heritage, they would ensure that the gravestone of Robert Sobukwe is preserved and repaired and protected against the absolute travesty that's occurred to his gravestone. I mean, like him or not, he's a very important historical figure in the history of South Africa, and they've allowed his kind of the place where he's resting to be destroyed. Now imagine a comparable figure in the United States. Robert Sobukwe is probably not Abraham Lincoln, but imagine if the Abraham Lincoln Memorial would just be kind of destroyed and the statue of Abraham Lincoln, like its head would be cut off, and the Americans were like, okay, I guess shit happens. I mean, no. If you're really serious about heritage, start there. Yeah, look at that. Protect the bloody gravestone. And this doesn't mean just fix it and then forget about it again, because in a year it's going to look the same way. So that's the first place to start if you really care about heritage. They don't actually care about heritage. They do care about Africanization, for lack of a better word. It's a kind of a game of social engineering. They want to make it clear to the world, and specifically, I think, to other African states, to partners in the, let's say, the global third world, that the ANC is a revolutionary movement that has stamped out the stain of Western civilization in South Africa. I think that is what it comes down to ultimately. That is transformationism. It is a intense, prolonged process of social engineering, whereby two things kind of happen, which is these things might seem at their face contradictory, but actually they kind of go together quite well. And that is a dual process of anglicization, like everything has to be English, like not Zulu or Khoza, English. Everything has to be English. And on the other hand, this kind of decolonial, post-colonial, African, what they call authentic Africanism, which is it's basically Western postmodernism, actually. But that those are the two things that kind of go hand in hand, and that's what this kind of transformation really comes down to. But for me, I've actually never really cared about name changes. You'll go back and you'll find that I didn't really write about this stuff because, and it's simple, there is no law in South Africa that compels you, me, anyone else to use any name of for anything. We can call South Africa Zania if we really want to. As we sit here, we can talk about it being a Zania. We can write it as the titles of books. We can do all sorts of things, calling South Africa exactly what we want to. Same goes for place names. Nothing compels anyone to use the names that politicians come up for with things in South Africa. So it has never really been to me about, oh, we have to kind of send in the submissions, sign the petitions. We have to stop these people from changing the names because they're going to change the names. What I recently wrote in Ondlar was that on a long enough timeline, every single Afrikaans or English name that South African place names have will be changed. And old Zulu names will be changed, and old Khoza names will be changed, and the political elite will just do what they want. They will all be changed. Kind of shouting and yelling at the sky about this is not going to help. What we need to do is domesticate the locus of control, the locus of authority for who determines what the names for places are. We need to do that psychologically. We need to do that commercially, and we need to do that culturally. And then it actually doesn't matter because that means the people of Graafrenet who want to call it Graafrenet will call it Graafrenet. Their businesses will be called the Graafrenet General Trader, the Graafrenet Advertiser, I don't know, newspaper, the Graafrenet Beauty Salon. Those will be their businesses. Same with street names. And other people who live nearby who want to call it Robert Sobukwe Town, they all have the Robert Sobukwe Town General Trader, and they all have the Robert Sobukwe Town Nail Salon. And all of that, believe it or not, can coexist in the same place. Like this has been happening all around the world for hundreds of years. Different people, different groups calling the same place by different names. It happens in Australia and New Zealand, where the indigenous people have their own names for places, and there are significant communities in these areas. That's what they call these places. Native American tribes in the U.S., they have old names for modern places, for the city of Seattle, for Portland. That's what they call these places. It's not like everyone is so bloody confused. What are they talking? No, it's fine. It works. It just works. The government can only decide what it is going to call a place. I do not care what the government calls a place. It could not matter less to me what the government calls a place. What does matter to me deeply, as an increasingly, let's say, Afrikaner conscious person, I'm getting increasingly conscious of my own heritage. What does matter to me is if my people completely forget about my heritage and the heritage of my people and pretend like we're just going to call it what the government calls it. To me, that is a community that has allowed itself to be co-opted by the state, and that's a problem. That is a big problem. That is not necessary. Zimbabweans before, while Rhodesia was still Rhodesia, black Zimbabweans called Salisbury Harare. That's what they did. They didn't say, oh God, they call it Salisbury, so we're going to call it Salisbury. They called it by the name that they prefer. And it's important to me that communities in South Africa, that self-conscious groups in South Africa, take that ownership back. They take that that locus of authority for determining what we call things, how we perceive reality, and they take it from the political elite and they nest it within their own control. So that's been my approach to name changes. Yes, you're going to have to use the official name when you mail something through the South African post office. I don't know why you would want to do that, but you have to do that. If you register your business, yes, on the form that goes in, you're going to have to use the official name. That's fine. Who cares? Who cares? The place name that we use in our daily interaction, in our culture, in our commerce. That's what really matters. That's what really matters. So yeah, there's nothing. This has nothing to do with heritage. The ANC, if it really wants to, can protect Robert Sobukwe's legacy by protecting his gravestone. They can establish a whole new city. They can build a whole new city called Robert Sobukwe City. They don't do any of this. They want to destroy the heritage of Afrikaners, of colonialism. That's what they want to do as a virtue signal for their revolutionary credentials. But that should not matter. That really should not matter, because we actually do have control over these things.
I think you have a good point there. And actually links, it reminds me of an article that Ayanda, that you published earlier this week. You one about rainbowism and, nation building in South Africa. And this idea that South Africa is supposed to be this diverse place with overlapping cultural importance. And I was just thinking that, like, yeah, there should be nothing, like, people, Afrikaners are going to call Cape Town Kaapstad. And I'm pretty sure there's Xhosa words for Cape Town. There's going to be Zulu words for Cape Town, because that's just how it works. But yet there's this, I think the problem comes is that the ANC is just pushing this idea that, no, we have to rename it entirely. It's also something that irritates me about people who want to name South Africa Azania. And I'm like, we have a South African non-colonial word for South Africa. It's Mzansi. We don't have to call it Azania, which is a Greek word for referring to the Horn of Africa. That's just what irritates me about that. It's a completely nonsensical word, and I think it is very much a litmus test if someone's retarded, if they think that South Africa should be called Azania. I think that I'm going to throw a spanner in the works, though, where there actually is a practical issue with renaming, and that there is a fiscal cost. Apparently it does cost in the millions to rename a place. Now, this is also probably because it's inflated, because they're going to have to find a BE tender partner to replace the signs. And then they're going to have to, for some reason, send some money to Google Maps to rename it, even though I'm pretty sure it cost nothing for them to rename the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. But yeah, and then there's a lot of flies that need to be changed. There's a lot of, so yes, it is a schlep to change it. That's why I think it's great to just say, honestly, I can this is what's weird. I can understand if we had a Adolf Hitler town. I think that if you're going to rename things like that and you want to try to sanitize some really dark history and you don't want to have any sort of glorification of it, I can understand that. But like, Port Elizabeth is not even named after a monarch. Like, it was founded before Elizabeth II and after Elizabeth I. It was in honor of the founder's wife. It's sweet. It's cute. There's nothing wrong with it, yet they renamed it, and also renamed it to a name that's very inaccessible to a large portion of South Africans. It's like, I'm not going to try pronounce it. I tried earlier. I practiced for about 15 minutes before recording this live stream, and I failed. I could barely pronounce stuff. Sorry?
It's just your white privilege coming through, Nicholas.
Yeah, it's my white privilege. Well, I also struggle to pronounce Afrikaans names, so it's more my English privilege. And also, would it be really privilege? I'm underprivileged in that my English has prevented me from having the incentives to learn other languages. See, I should I could have been, if I'd been born in a different language, I would have had to learn English, and I would have known two languages. See, I'm actually underprivileged here. My ancestors being so good at empire building just has really screwed me over now. But I think, Ayanda, I was going to ask you, and I can still ask you this question, but I also want to just know your general views on this. But my question is there any actual justification for renaming? I think I already touched on this a little bit, but I want to know your views. Is there any places that should be renamed? And also, do you agree with Martin? What do you think?
Yeah. Thanks very much, for having me today, Nicholas. It's truly a pleasure to be here with you and Martin, to have a discussion on what, I think is shaping up to be a very analytically rich discussion. Just the first point, I think if someone like Andile Mkutama was here, he would have bashed you guys for butchering so many names. He would have been like, that's why these white people are a problem. They can't pronounce things. But I won't bash you guys. It's fine. It's fine. We won't take it there. But look, man, I think this thing of renaming towns and by extension, right, the monuments and, pulling statues down and everything. I think it's important for us to acknowledge that this is a complicated issue. It's a very complicated issue, and in the South African context, it involves a lot of emotion. And I think even if you look at the reaction to the entire Graaff-Reinet thing, right, it being renamed to Robert Sobukwe Town, I mean, you've seen the reaction from some quarters of the country that this is indeed a very emotionally charged, emotive issue where people, as Martin has alluded, feel like their heritage is being erased or is being marginalized in the country. So I think it's important for us to acknowledge that this is a very emotionally charged thing. And when you listen to some of the arguments on the other side, right, on these things, towns and monuments, what you get is that these are not just historical artifacts or mere statues. These are symbols, right? Symbols that represent certain things to those people who are making those arguments, right? People who represent certain values and ideas. And from where those people are coming from, countries have identities, right? They undergo different phases of history and they have identities. And for them, if you listen carefully, it's almost as if the point being made is we have graduated from colonial rule, right? We have graduated from apartheid rule. We now have this democracy in place, however flawed it is. And that democracy has its own identity, right? According to them, that we ushered in 1994. It is anchored, at least on paper, in certain values, fairness, inclusivity, diversity, equality, etc. And for those people, the argument that they will make is, now that our country has that identity and now that that is our normative vision, why should we have monuments of people like Cecil John Rhodes, for instance, right? They would argue, this is not me, but they would argue, why should we have a monument of Cecil John Rhodes, who, as a person, represented the entire opposite of what our new country represents? We stand for fairness, we stand for diversity, we stand for inclusivity, we stand for non-racialism. And yet here at the University of Cape Town, for instance, where a statue was pulled down, we have a man who was a racist, who was a colonialist, who did not recognize the humanity of other people who look like us. So why should someone who represents those values and ideas, be honored or be represented in this country we are building? Because these statues, as I've said, are symbols that represent how we imagine ourselves as a country and where we're going towards. So that is the kind of argument you hear from the other side. And I think it is important to acknowledge it, not because you agree with it, but because you're trying to understand it. Even in the case of Graaff-Reinet, right? This town is named after someone who was the governor of the Cape Colony at some point, and his wife, right? Again, they would make the same argument to say, these are people who were colonialists. They would argue that and say, they represent colonialism, they represent that period of our history which we have moved away from, and we don't think that they should have a place in a country where we now have a different identity, and our entire constitutional order, at least on paper, is anchored in different values. But here's where I want to move to, Nicholas, because this is the important point that Martin has alluded to in his comments. The renaming of towns, the calls for certain monuments to be taken down, these things aren't happening in a vacuum. They are being narrated by the political situation. That is to say, they are being informed by what is going on in politics. So today, we could argue that people like Cecil John Rhodes should be pulled down. But dare I say tomorrow, the younger generation is going to say Nelson Mandela should go down because it's a sellout. Because the point here is it's being narrated by politics. It's not happening in a vacuum. And here's the thing about this relationship between the politics and what is going on. The danger here is that you have people who want to read the past, but they use modern standards to read the past. So you aren't reading the past by its own standards. You're reading the past by today's standards. And the thing is, the past standards are not the standards of today. So if you're going to do that, that's you being anachronistic. There's a term for this in history. It's called anachronism, when you interpret or judge the past by modern standards. And the danger with that, Nicholas, is if you're going to do that, you miss that ideas which we today find revolting, we condemn, whether it's racism or colonialism, these are ideas which were normally accepted back then. I mean, slavery at some point in history was a widely accepted practice. There was nothing wrong with it, it was the norm. In fact, if you had assets and you were declaring your assets on the assets registry, you would say, I have slaves as part of my assets. Today, we say it's a bad thing to reduce another human being to a commodity that can be bought and sold at will. But back then, it was the norm. I could make the same argument with racism. Today, racism is something I would like to think many of us condemn. But back then, it wasn't an aberration. It was the norm. These were widely accepted ideas which people were raised to, internalize, or they were socialized to internalize them. So if you're going to say that we should, criticize people on the basis of modern standards, what you're going to miss is that from their perspective, where they were living in that period of history, from their own perspective, not your perspective as a historian or someone who's reflecting on the past, but from their perspective, there was nothing wrong with it. There was nothing wrong for me as a Cecil John Rhodes to make the comments that I made about Black people. There was nothing wrong for me as a Karl Marx to make racist comments about Black people, because I grew up in a period, I lived and wrote in a period of history where these ideas were circulating. And naturally, my thinking was also influenced by them. So there's a need for us, when we reflect, even on the Graaff-Reinet thing, when we reflect on history, to not excuse the crimes or the injustices that were committed, but to recognize that it is a mistake to judge the past by today's standards. We need to judge the past by the standards of yesterday and try and understand why in the first place people espoused those kinds of things. Now, this is moving naturally to my last point. The problem with anachronism is then, if you're going to read history anachronistically, reading it backwards, as I've said, if you're going to read history backwards, you're also going to miss the nuances, because this is where, again, we have a problem, whether it is the Graaff-Reinet thing or Cecil John Rhodes or whoever else. Once you read history anachronistically, you then box people into these, neat and simple categories. Oh, they were villains, and they were heroes, they were bad people, and they were good guys. And if you read history in that way, you then fail to appreciate that the lines at some point were blurred, or the picture wasn't black or white, but that there were gray areas at times. The Cecil John Rhodes in question, right? People can argue that he was a colonialist, he was this, he was that. But this was the guy who, whether directly or indirectly, because the Rand lords paid taxes to the state at some point, directly or indirectly, this is the guy who made massive contributions to the industrialization of the country, whether it was the highways that your cars glide on today in Johannesburg, whether it was, the universities that we go to today. For better or for worse, that guy's wealth did that, right? I could take it to someone like Paul Clear, who I've written about before, to say that, yes, you can criticize him for whatever you want to criticize him for, but there's also a history here. There are people who are saying that Queen Victoria, who, if I'm not wrong, stands before Parliament in Cape Town, I could be correct on this, but those people stood for values which we didn't stand for as a people. But when we were in charge of the country, we never pulled their statues down. We never pulled them down, not because we don't have differences with them or because we don't disagree with things that they did, but because we believe that even if those things did happen, history is not as simple as we think it is. And in this case, this is what I want to emphasize. History is not as simple and straightforward as some people today want to present it as. There are those gray areas. There are those nuances. People do bad things, but in the same breath, they do good things, or they do things which are interpreted by other people as being good. And if we're going to adopt that kind of approach of reading history, backwards and then reading history anachronistically, we are going to arrive at a point where we say, take down all these things, as Martin has said, change the towns, and everything. And what I think we miss at the end of the day is that even if you want to make the argument that we have moved forward as a country, we have moved past all these things, what you will miss is that keeping those statues, keeping those names is in fact a reminder of just how far we have moved past those things as a country. So you want to keep those things there as a reminder to people that yes, we have passed these periods historically, and we are now in a position where we're trying to move forward and forge something of a national identity, or whatever it is, or however you want to phrase it. So back to your question, Nicholas. It's a simple one. Do I believe names should be changed? Do I believe monuments should be taken down? No, I don't think so. Keep those monuments in place. Do not read history simplistically, and appreciate the country you live in, which is a diverse country where historical figures and where towns are going to be polarizing because we all come at it differently. We all interpret these things differently.
Nick, can I add to that?
Oh, yes, you can.
Yeah, so I think what Ayanda said kind of is crucial in that different communities interpret things differently. Certainly across the, like my big spiel always is that South Africa has an excessively thematic understanding of history rather than a detailed understanding of history. Like history has many details, there's many nuances, and there are themes that kind of cut across those nuances, but you have to kind of understand both. Like you can't read an article just by looking at the heading, and that's where South Africa kind of falls down. Like we look back, and this is a point that I've recently made in my writing about transformationism, is like South Africa looks back at Jan Smuts, for example, and they see, oh, he's a racist. Okay, cool. So we're going to forget about him completely, take his name off the airport, take his, our international affairs department won't even acknowledge the man exists, despite him being effectively the creator of the rules-based international order as we know it today, which our Durko is saying, oh, we have to believe in the rules-based international order. It's like, well, have some pride then. Like you say it with real conviction. Say that we are the country of Jan Smuts. We have a tradition of this stuff. This is what we've believed in this for 2 centuries now. But no, Durko would never say that ever, because they have a thematic understanding of history. Jan Smuts, racist, blah, done. So that's a problem. That's a big problem. Because of course Jan Smuts was a racist. Of course he was a racist. But that's not all that he did. That's not all that he believed. So we have to acknowledge the details. And I've discovered that you get less worked up about things if you understand the details. You understand people in their context, and you realize, yes, there is evil in history. There's absolutely evil in history. But these were flawed human beings. They made mistakes. They were like you and me, people who thought a certain way about the world in error, and they tried to do the best with what they had. And they failed, and you just get a deeper appreciation of how normal things are. Like, just, it's okay, just relax. Like we're working on it. It's life is a work in progress, rather than, oh my god, history is this mountain that rests on our shoulders that's crushing us. Like, you just lose that if you understand the details of history. And that's why I always encourage people, if you read about apartheid, you have to read about apartheid from the people who supported apartheid as well. You have to understand why they did these things. If you want to understand socialism and communism, you have to understand why Marx and Lenin and Stalin and Thomas Sankara and Julius Nyerere, why they did believe these things. And then you'll realize these weren't just a bunch of evil kind of mustache twirling people, but they were flawed. There's exceptions. Hitler was evil. In his own time, in his own context, he was evil. He said that he wanted to do harm to the people around him. So there is real evil in history, but you must also understand that evil from the mouth of the evildoer. Otherwise, you're going to make mistakes. So that's the one thing. But the other thing is, I think you solve this problem by, I think you finally solve this problem by respecting spheres and domains. Not everyone in South Africa should value Jan Smuts. Not everyone in South Africa should value Cecil John Rhodes. I am not going to value Chris Hani. I despise the idea of Chris Hani. I like horrible person. But that's not for me. That's not for me to value. He's not part of my heritage. But there's people who value Chris Hani, and they should be on their property in their institutions. They should be allowed to value Chris Hani. If there is if I don't know, the Communist Party establishes a political school and they erect a statue of Chris Hani at the entrance of that political school, yes, that's wonderful. This is their domain. If you go to the Communist Party political school, then you know there's going to be a huge statue of Chris Hani. If you come to the Free Market Foundation, you're going to find a massive portrait of F.A. Hayek. That's our heritage. The problem comes in when you, and this is not the ANC's fault by any means. The NP did this. The South African Party did this in South Africa. If you make these heritage focal points state property, it becomes a problem, because then everyone has to pay for it. Then everyone has to associate with it. Like the University of Cape Town is state property. Why is it state property? Like Cecil John Rhodes, when he kind of contributed to founding this thing, he should have said that this thing will be owned by the Cecil John Rhodes Trust now and forevermore. And my statue will sit on this thing and it will fund itself. It's not a taxpayer venture. Same with the Potchefstroom University, which was a private Christian. It was the seminary of the NG Kerk, or no, it was the Hervormde Kerk. But they made it a state institution, and now Afrikaners, my people, complain about anglicizing the Potchefstroom University, and I'm like, why are you complaining? They made it a state institution. We can't complain now. We made a mistake. We have to start over. We have to build academia. We have to build our own institutions and make sure that they remain our own. So I think the point there is just that we can avoid all of this by ensuring that the state stays out of heritage domains entirely. If there's a neo-Nazi group in Germany that wants to honor Adolf Hitler, they must be allowed to do so. I know it's illegal in Germany right now. People will go to prison for doing that. That's wrong. That's wrong. I despise Adolf Hitler. I despise everything that he stood for. But if you statify these things, then you create problems, because it's never just going to be Hitler. The AfD in Germany, the Alternative for Germany, I disagree with their immigration policies completely. But they are often described as being neo-Nazi. These are centrists, ladies and gentlemen. These are not far-right neo-Nazis. Go look at their policies. These are centrists. They're very spicy on immigration, but now they're neo-Nazis, and the German federal government has investigated them for whether they should be banned as a neo-Nazi group before. That is a problem. Stop getting the state involved in this stuff. Seriously. The state has no role to play here. You elevate the temperature of politics. You think you're doing a good thing. You think you're balancing diversity. You're making society inclusive. That's what you think right now. But in 10 years, a Charlie Kirk happens. Someone is shot dead because you made the state everything. You made the state part of everything. And when people then share their views, the costs are high. So we need to lower the temperature of politics, and specifically in South Africa, we need to do that by detaching the state from matters of heritage, given exactly as Ayanda said. This gets people passionate, and rightly so, from all sides, because history is complicated, and unfortunately not everyone has a detailed history or understanding of history. And for that reason specifically, we need to dislodge the state, take the state out of this thing, so that people who value things can value them in their own time, with their own money, on their own property.
I think both of you guys said everything beautifully. I think I'm going to more crassly in my own way finish off this topic because I just wanted to quickly talk about my heritage because English people in South Africa have a little bit of a weird thing because our heritage is not as clear. We do have it. It's just that we don't really talk about that much. But one of them I would say is UCT. UCT is a very much an Anglo institution that was founded by Cecil John Rhodes, and I do think, regardless of his controversy, he built this place. It should, as you say, Martin, it should be a private institution funded by the by Rhodes Foundation or Rhodes Trust, and his statue shouldn't have come down. And I just want to say for what you're saying, and about people looking judging history anachronistic. My pronunciation is terrible today, but basically by modern standards. And this is what they did with Rhodes. And I find it so weird because the people in South Africa, particularly, who should have the biggest issue with Rhodes are Afrikaners. He started the First Boer War. It was his policies that led to the Second Boer War and genocide. Cecil John Rhodes, the people who should hate him the most in this country are Afrikaners. Yet his statue remained throughout apartheid. It survived Afrikaner political dominance. Yet it was a bunch of brain dead students with no basis of history. They don't even know who Cecil John Rhodes is, and they tore down his statue. For all they knew, it wasn't even Cecil John Rhodes. It was just it was the thinker. But they just tore it down because they wanted to avoid exams. And I was there when the poo was thrown in it. I know how stupid these people were. And I just, it's because locally, Cecil John Rhodes wanted Black South Africans to have gun rights. That's not something that you do when you want to enslave people. You don't arm them. He was not this white supremacist. Well, the thing is, in the context of the day, in the context of the day, he definitely was not. In the context of the day, he was probably a very progressive liberal. He cared about money, and that was actually he didn't care about race as much. He cared about his bottom line, which I know a lot of people hate that. I kind of respect it as an amoral capitalist. But I think that's a good jumping off point, especially because you're talking about Europe, Martin. And this is where our next topic begins, which is that Poland, a country that was devastated by decades, not centuries, of Russian imperialism, then had a little brief independence, then was wrecked by German and Russian imperialism at the same time. Lest we not forget the Nazis and the Soviets colluded to divide Poland between them. It was then enslaved as a state serving the interests of the communist Russia, where it did not allow it, where it was effectively a colony. It was a colony right up until the 90s. It was a colony for longer than any of the African countries, which complain about colonialism now as still the reason why they failure. And it has been independent for roughly the same amount of time that South Africa has been democratic and after overcoming apartheid. Except now, Poland is now in the top 20 largest economies in the world by GDP. It is an industrial powerhouse. I would believe it is possibly it is the future of Europe. I think it's the only country in Europe that I'm truly bullish on. And compared to South Africa, which started out far more powerful and far more successful, we are roughly, I think we're 46th in the world, and we're roughly half of its GDP. We're just continuing to slip while Poland is growing. And I think this is an important thing to discuss, especially as the IMF, in the same week as this Polish announcement, has been talking about how regulations are what are killing South Africa's economy. There's a paper published called Enhancing South Africa's Business Environment to Boost Growth and Create Jobs. It was published on 11th of March 2026. And it's basically just saying that it's simple why. So it's what we've been saying from Rational Standard, from the Free Market Foundation. What we've been saying, red tape and regulations are stopping South Africans from getting jobs, from growing the economy, from escaping poverty. I just think it's good to discuss this contrast between Poland and South Africa, because I think that we both escaped an oppressive system in relatively the same amount of time, but we've gone in drastically different directions. Ayanda, what are your thoughts on this? I know we were discussing just before the pod started. We were discussing the IMF report, and then we ran out of time, and then we had to go straight into the podcast.
Yeah. We're on a new topic, and I will speak about it like in a few moments. But you see, the emotion I was talking about earlier on the whole renaming thing, it came out in Nicholas now when we were speaking about roads. And that was precisely my point. These are emotionally charged things. There's nothing wrong with, the emotion. I love it. I mean, I'm here for it. But the thing about Poland, man, and I spoke to someone about this the other day. For me, it is really heartbreaking, because when you read the works of someone like Francis Fukuyama, right, who published his famous essay, which he then later developed into a book, right, The End of History and the Lost Man, right. That essay, if you read it today, right, it reflects, the exuberance of the time, right? I mean, that entire communist edifice was coming down, so there was naturally this, joy and excitement that finally, history is coming to an end. There's a clear winner in this ideological war, right, that has been raging for the longest time, right? And I think in some ways, countries like Poland, I'm going to get myself in trouble for this, but in some way, countries like Poland, you can sort of make the argument that for them, history has, in a sense, ended. They have crossed that line that Francis Fukuyama said they will cross, and that is why they are where they are at today. But for countries like South Africa, you get the sense that maybe for us, history hasn't ended. That ideological battle, or that battle of ideas, is still raging. It's still ongoing in South Africa. And because we haven't arrived at a point where we are able to disentangle the emotion, from the politics, we haven't arrived at a point where we are able to disentangle our sense of who we are from the economics, we will not be able to make the progress that Poland has made. Poland has made remarkable progress. But if we're going to be in a situation where we still think that certain ideologies or certain models of organizing society and our politics are somehow authentically African, or they are an authentic expression of who we are as a people, right? We genuinely psyop ourselves into thinking, no, Marxism is an authentic expression of who we are, as people. We are communitarians, and so forth. We believe in community, not this individualist, hyper-individualist capitalism, which is responsible for environmental degradation, poverty, and inequality. If we're still having those kinds of discussions, and if that kind of thinking is still in our politics, it'll be very difficult for us to adopt what, in my view, are just sensible policies of organizing the economy, of organizing the country, and making progress. We will keep moving around in circles while the rest of the world is making visible progress. This is not to say that other parts of the world, like Poland, don't have their own fair share of problems, but they've made visible progress. You could take it to China, which has made progress. You could take it to some Southeast Asian states, Singapore, which is always brought up in these discussions. These are countries which embraced policies that work, and they have seen the results. Here in South Africa, I think we are still dealing with that thing where we're pulling in different directions. Even in the GNU now, if you look at it, they call it the Government of National Unity. But you guys are not pulling in the same direction ideologically. You're pulling in different directions. So I don't think we have arrived at a point where we are willing to look at other countries like Poland dispassionately and look at what we can learn for them. We are still in this position where we think ideas which haven't worked in other parts of the world can somehow work for us. And just the last point I want to make before I hand it over to Martin is that on this question of Poland and the kind of reforms it has adopted, we must never forget where we are coming from, whether it is in South Africa or whether in Poland, where people were under communist rule for so long and they were oppressed. We must never, ever forget the victims of communism, because the victims of fascism historically received justice. Those crimes publicly were condemned, and people in certain cases where applicable were arrested and they faced the full might of the law. But that has not been the case for the victims of communism in countries like Poland. It has not been the case. I would argue that those people have not received true justice for the unimaginable suffering that they had to endure under those regimes. Today, it is convenient for people to say those were not true representations of Marxism, those were projects which went astray. And the true answer is no, those were not projects which went astray. Those were authentic representations of communism. And that is why people lost their lives. That is why there was misery. That is why there was so much strife and suffering. And through all of that, those of us who do not agree with those ideas have still said that we can live in a society where people who espouse them are given a platform, are allowed to express themselves, unsilenced. But we know for a fact that those people who were responsible for those things, were they to take power again, even in South Africa, all of us who are in this room right now would be sent to some gulag or some labor camp where we would be overworked or starved to death. We would not be given airtime, would not be allowed to express our views on these things. So I bring that up just as the broader context to say that we should never ever forget, when we bring up Poland, we should never ever forget what Poland, countries like Poland, have went through as a result of communism. And it is precisely that history that should make us despise communism. But my fear is that we haven't moved beyond it. And that is why we are stuck. That is why unemployment policy choice. We have chosen to keep young people out of the labor market. You can create jobs for them, but it is politically convenient for you to create this massive reservoir of unemployed people that you keep at bay with grants and other social goods, and that allows you to stay in power for as long as you want to. But if you want to change that, you can. You can wake up tomorrow morning and remove all the burdens, all.
I think we lost your audio, Ayanda, which is unfortunate because I was loving what you were saying. You back? Oh, damn. Okay. We've lost him, unfortunately, which is very sad because I was enjoying that. I just wanted to step in, and I think this is great because it links to the history, the discussion on the history that we were having previously, where this internet. You can imagine, like, this is also another result of South Africa's socialism, is that we could have actually had decent first world internet by now if the state hadn't effectively nationalized internet for so long. A lot of people don't realize that if you want to do anything to do with the internet, like how long, do you know, like for years and years and years, you had to go through state monopoly. And that's why our internet sucks in South Africa, and it's only starting to get good because fiber is not state monopoly. It's a private oligopoly instead, which is always slightly better. But I would say with the history is, I think that the problem is in South Africa, we whine about history. We use history as an excuse, when in Poland, they learn from history. They know what screwed up their society, so they did the opposite. They went away from it. And what I love about them is that they are what should be common sense. They saw Nazism as evil, fascism as evil, and communism as evil. It's not a choice between two evils. Cool. Ayanda, you back?
Yeah, sorry for that.
There's no problem. I was just complaining about how socialism destroyed South Africa's internet, and it's affecting you now.
No, it's certainly affecting me now, but the last point I wanted to make here is we have not won the ideological battle in South Africa. History hasn't ended in South Africa. We are still involved in that tussle. And I think that for me is the problem. And that is why the work we do at the Free Market Foundation is important. Now, this is going to sound funny, but I think of this thing as an Hegelian dialectic, right? There's a dominant sort of idea in society that would be the thesis. What is our antithesis in South Africa? It is freedom. And I think that contradiction should naturally lead us to a new reality. But I think that confrontation, as I've said, is what we're still going through. We haven't realized the synthesis, because that is sort of what emerges from that dialectical process.
Yeah, I really like that. What I mentioned when you were slightly out as well is I was saying that the thing that makes Poland so good is that they learned from history, when in South Africa, we just like whining about using an excuse while repeating the original sins. the original sin of colonialism and apartheid is racial supremacy, it's racialized policy. And South Africa just does it again. When Poland realized, hey, state control and dictatorship and authoritarianism is what destroyed our society, so we're going to have freedom. And that's what I think makes them so much better. And successful societies learn from their mistakes. They don't just repeat it and try to reverse it. Martin.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, this is the key thing. History it can either be a thriller, a story for us to read out of interest's sake, or it's a collection of lessons that we need to understand and internalize. A lot of people see history as the former. It's an interesting story that we might deploy in the same way we use Game of Thrones memes. Like, we want to make a political point, so we use a Game of Thrones memes or a Lord of the Rings meme. We want to make a political point, so we use a meme from history. Again, this theme versus detail thing, where, oh yeah, no, you're just saying that because you want apartheid back or something like that. Like, it's a meme that's being deployed rather than actually understanding history and learning the actual lessons that it's teaching you. Because, I mean, this point is key, that Poland is extremely aware of its history under communism and Russian imperialism. Like, as Ayanda said, like, we dare not forget the victims of communism. Poland does not forget the victims of communism. They have memorials, they have museums about the horrors of communism. I visited at least one of them, or two of them, when I was in Warsaw a few years ago. Something you'll never see in South Africa. In South Africa, we pretend that we've now learned from history and that we're moving away from it. That is a complete farce. Like, we are in actual practice, we've changed very little. Like, race law logic continues unabated. The same logic of national party economic regulation continues unabated in South Africa. The same things that created the poverty that pervades in the society along racial lines is what Cyril Ramaphosa recently said we need to double down back on. Like, one of the key social policies of the National Party was a restriction on the number of taverns and shebeens in townships. Like, that was a key feature of white supremacy during apartheid, to say that black people can't control their liquor, so we have to limit their exposure to alcohol. Cyril Ramaphosa, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, said that we need to have limitations on density in townships. My God, we have not learned from history. So the Polish have, and that is why they must rightly take our position in the G20. Like, wonderful that we are getting kicked out of the G20, and we should be kicked out of the G20 and replaced by Poland, because it richly deserves that position. Now, with that being said, I don't think Poland has learned the full lesson yet. They are supposed to be my goodness, they must be the key pillar in Europe of anti-Russian activism. I want to use the word activism. Not in the sense of throwing paint on paintings. I'm talking about being activity. They must be the pillar of anti-Russian activity in Europe. And I don't want to diminish the value of Polish support for Ukraine. I think it's valuable. Obviously, the Ukrainians value it highly. But why has Poland? I'm not even going to ask why is Germany and France not. I mean, good Lord Almighty. Why has Poland not sent reinforcements to the front line? Why not? That is, I'm not asking that flippantly. I mean, this is a serious question that Poland needs to ask itself. Why is it not fighting alongside Ukrainians on the front line? That's serious stuff. Russia needs to be pushed back, because Poland knows better than anyone else what Russian designs are on Eastern Europe. The whole story. Russia wants a buffer between Moscow and the West. That story has not changed in the last, I don't know, 400 years. That is still what is happening right now. The Russian elite wants a buffer between Moscow and the West, and they will push all the way as far as they can. So Poland knows that. Poland knows the writing is on the wall. So it needs to get in there. And it knows that you can't win battles without reinforcements. The story of the Warsaw Uprising is one of the most tragic stories in human history. Polish resistance and Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto. they rose up against Nazi imperialism. And I'm committing the same error that I was criticizing, and that I don't know the details. But I think that the Russian advance, the Soviet advance, paused. They paused when they heard about the uprising, because they did not want a strong Polish resistance in post-Nazi Poland. So they stopped and said, let the Germans sort out the Poles and the Jews. And they sorted them out very good. They killed masses of people. Poland must understand the value of reinforcements. They must understand the value of reinforcements more than anyone else. And that's why Poland needs to be on the front line in Ukraine. And I think lots of other people also need to be on the front line in Ukraine, but Poland specifically. So I don't think they learned that lesson entirely. And then just my parting words on this is that Poland is following a set formula. People don't like us liberals and Francis Fukuyama because we deal in universals. Every society ever that has followed this formula has succeeded. There is not one exception. There is not one exception anywhere of a country that has implemented a relatively free market and failed at it. If you've implemented a relatively free market, you succeed. That's the rule. That is the God-given truth. That's how it works. That is life. That is reality. Poland does it. They're succeeding. South Africa rallies against it. We're failing. And just on that thesis and synthesis thing, this is my, admittedly, let's say, bad understanding of Fukuyama's thesis of the end of history. And I think in that sense, he was right. I think that a lot of liberals miss, I mean, Fukuyama today is not a liberal, but maybe back then, this is correct. When there's strife, conflict, whatever kind of civil issues breakdown, liberalism is always the synthesis. Always. In South Africa, you had black nationalism, you had Afrikaner nationalism. Neither of these things had any liberalism in it. And yet, the synthesis of these two things was liberalism. That is the end of history thesis. It is that when you bring Nazi fascism and Soviet communism together, the synthesis is liberalism. If you bring tribalisms of different things together, the synthesis is liberalism. Liberalism is always the default political organization to which any society that hopes to come out of strife and conflict resorts to. And that is the beauty of it. That is the beauty of it. Liberalism is the fallback. And that's why I always say that the liberal order is inevitable. Like, it's really on the back foot now, and we shouldn't be kind of resting on our laurels of this. Freedom does lose battles, and people die, and societies get completely and utterly destroyed when freedom loses battles. But liberalism is always the inevitable. If you work at it, it's the synthesis of this dialectic. So yeah, I just wanted to throw that in there to say that I think the end of history thesis is maybe overstated, certainly, and then certainly overinterpreted by many liberals who thought that we can now go home and stop working for freedom. The Poles continued working for freedom. But I think it's maybe a little bit unfortunately maligned, and that we need to make a case that liberalism is actually, it's always that thing that you're going to default to when you come out of a period of intense civil strife or breakdown.
Very good. I think to be a little bit fair on Fukuyama, so because that is one of the most misquoted of his essays. We did it in political science when I was studying years ago, and even the lecturer misunderstood it. But Fukuyama was something which you would agree with completely. Is he was warning about the West becoming complacent against Russia, against China, against enemies of liberalism. So, and I think that was where he was completely right. We did in the 90s, especially, we got very complacent because the 90s was a great time to live, unless you were in Rwanda or South Africa, or most of the world. It was great if you were in America. To answer a question from the comments before we close off, there's asked, isn't it Poland getting involved in Ukraine due to NATO limitations? So I thought this as well, but I actually looked into it. So there's nothing in the NATO regulations that disallows Poland from actually getting directly involved. There are practical threats that Russia is a nuclear power and might see Poland as and I think that a lot of people, is the problem with MAD and all this and nuclear powers in general, is that they're afraid that Russia might get more batshit and actually nuke them if they get involved. But it's not actually NATO that's stopping them. I think that's a good place to end off as we come on to the hour. Any closing statements from you, Martin or Ayanda, before we finish off?
Cool. Yeah, I guess I would just say that just on that point, just so that the point is well made. The current American intervention in Iran was not approved by NATO. Mark Rutte is very good. He's a former Dutch prime minister. The Dutch have completely lost their marbles on this. Speaking as someone of Dutch heritage, I think the Netherlands needs to shut the fuck up. But Mark Rutte is very good as the Secretary General of NATO. But it's not like NATO met and approved the American strikes on Iran. So if Poland were to get involved in Ukraine, that's not something that NATO can say, oh, you're not allowed to because we didn't meet to approve it. Well, you don't need to approve lots of things that America does, including taking out Nicolas Maduro and so on. So no, Poland can come to this decision by itself. I don't know if the EU has certain rules. Maybe who cares? The EU is a voluntary kind of club. But yeah, I mean, just on that point, it's Polish politics. It's Polish politics, and again, like Nicolas says, kind of unnecessary fears in my view, unfounded fears in my view, but fears nonetheless that stop them from getting involved. Ayanda.
I'm not sure if I'm audible because this connectivity thing pulling me back. But I think my final comments are Martin has hit the nail on the head. I think in as far as the renaming of things is concerned, I think he's hit the nail on the head. I mean, what we're dealing with here is what you would call the tragedy of the commons. I think that's what he was alluding to earlier on. And I think there's a way to just resolve that. As he said, he's provided the solution to that. Because at the end of the day, government is actually a corporation ran by people. Right? This is not some amorphous thing which doesn't exist. And if the political elite in charge of that institution says that a banner about race regulation by Solidarity should go down because it's on public property, it will go down, unfortunately. That is the reality. So how do you solve that? I think Martin has provided the solution. On the second point, I think we are dealing with this dialectic, and we are yet to see, at least in our case, what the synthesis is going to be. Someone made an interesting response in the article I wrote on rainbowism, and they said that, you know, they feel like we had three options post 1994. We had classical liberalism, we had Afrikaner nationalism, and we had rainbowism. And whoever said, let us go for rainbowism, was trying to suppress both Afrikaner nationalism and classical liberalism. Now, I'm not going to go into whether that is an accurate argument or not. I do think it's interesting, but they haven't expanded on why they have said that. They've also made a point that rainbowism hasn't really worked in the USA. That's their argument. I won't go into it. But what I will say is, from our end, with the work that we do at organizations like the Free Market Foundation, is that we are going to continue to push for the ideas that we push for, because I believe that confrontation, we need to have that confrontation, and it needs to produce something else. And the danger with not fighting for what you want is that you end up getting something else. So we mustn't water down liberalism. We must continue to champion liberalism, so we arrive at the synthesis we want to arrive at. Because if we don't, my fear is that we may not arrive where we want to arrive.
Very well put. Thank you for joining us on this week's episode of the Rational Side podcast. Make sure to join us next week on YouTube, Facebook, and X. Also, make sure to follow us on Facebook, Rational Standard, X, which will be at Rational Stand. Make sure to follow all of us on X. I'm at N Woode-Smith, and is at AS Zulu, and I think Martin, you are at Martin Van Staden, Martin V. Staden.
At Martin_ASFL.
Cool, perfect. That's a blast from the past. And also make sure to, most importantly, check out our website, rationalstandard.com, where we post daily articles many of which we discuss the topics which we discuss in these podcasts in much more depth. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week.